Please join me in welcoming to the stage this evening's honoree, Andrea Mitchell. Like Seeds of Peace founder John Wallach, Andrea Mitchell was a White House correspondent. Like John Wallach, she has traveled the globe to connect her viewers to the most important stories of our time. As NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent, you approach your work with the same values that we Seeds hold dear: the courage to engage in difficult conversation and a deep respect for varied opinions and views. So it is for that reason, and for all the brilliant work that you do day in and day out, it is my great honor to present you with the John P. Wallach Peacemaker Award.
Well, I especially need my notes because I'm so really overcome with emotion. To be honored is wonderful and very meaningful, but to be honored and introduced by Salma and to see her again and for you all to hear the depth of conviction and passion and understanding and the power of empathy, to use her phrase, from this young woman is profoundly touching to me. So thank you, thank you. Thank you for all that you do by your presence, by your financial support, by your political support of peace, of dialogue, of constructive engagement by these young people. This is the future, and it could never be more important, I think, than today. I take this honor really as a celebration of all of you and of all the young people, those I met and all of the others who attended, who were returned campers, who were counselors, who were dialogue coaches, and all of those who have been so involved in this organization for all of the years since it was the brainchild of John Wallach, whom I knew and traveled with when we were covering foreign policy back in the day. It's a celebration of your work to build understanding among young people toward peace, the resolution of conflicts through honest conversation, and always the inclusion of critical voices. Salma, when we first met last summer, we were 1 month into the Gaza war, and I asked you in another part of our interview, Salma, you're here at a time of war back home. How complicated does that make it for you? You replied, it's so complicated for me and confusing because I am here having fun, laughing and playing while the children in Gaza are dying. A thought, an emotion that an ambivalence that you expressed tonight when you spoke of the guilt of being in Maine. As you may recall, we were sitting with Yoran, who was also 17 at the time, and only a year away from military service in the IDF. He told us, people would think that because it's a war, it's not the right time to talk about peace. But we say exactly the opposite, that this is exactly the right time. I was so struck then by how both of you embraced the importance of structured dialogues and how brave it was, really, truly brave, for you and the other Seeds to feel free to express your pain, your anger, your guilt, your sorrow, your frustration, all in the service of reaching better understandings. Before we parted, I asked what you were hoping each other would come away understanding about the other. Yoran said, the other side is also people. They have a faith, a personality. I think he meant also a humanity. You, Salma, said, like if a soldier is going to carry a gun and point it at a Palestinian, I need to let him think twice. Make him count to 3 before he does it. Just as Seeds has changed all of the young people who attend, who have taken part for more than 2 decades now, it changed me. I came away, and looking back tonight was a great reminder. Thinking about the struggle for peace in the Middle East that has really defined my career as an NBC correspondent. One of my earliest assignments, I started in the summer of 1978. I wasn't a child correspondent, so do the math. And one of my earliest assignments was to fill in for my great friend and colleague Judy Woodruff, who was covering the White House, because she was going to Camp David. So I had to go and cover Rosalind Carter, filling in for Jimmy Carter at a campaign trip, a Senate race in Texas on Labor Day weekend, 1978. It was my first trip to Andrews Air Force Base, my first trip on a White House, the blue and white plane, Air Force Two, and I was so proud and so excited, and I did what any nice Jewish girl from New Rochelle, New York does. I went to Lord & Taylor's and bought a silk dress, a shirtwaist, long sleeves, high neck, to be proper for the First Lady. My senior colleague, Ann Compton from ABC, looked at me when we got to Andrews and she said, "Are you crazy? It's going to be 110 degrees. You're going to be on a flatbed truck in San Antonio, and you're not going to survive your first assignment as a White House sort of substitute correspondent." But the real story, of course, was happening at Camp David, which Judy was covering. But then, when the accords were signed on the North Lawn of the White House in 1979, that was my assignment. I was standing next to John Chancellor, our anchor at the time, standing on the roof of the Hay Adams Hotel with this panorama of the 3 men at that historic table signing the accords. And I realized that this was such a moment of history, and that I was witnessing it a little removed across Lafayette Square, but I was seeing it all. And this was bringing together Israel and Egypt, and there was going to be peace in my lifetime. It was unforgettable. Those 13 days at Camp David with 3 larger-than-life personalities, all 3 real leaders. And that was recreated. I don't know how many of you saw it. There's now a book by Lawrence Wright, but it was first a play before it was his book, premiering in Washington at Arena Stage. And last year when we went to it, I was sitting right across the aisle from Jimmy and Rosalind Carter as they watched the actor Richard Thomas and Hallie Foote recreating Jimmy and Rosalind at Camp David and recreating the tense talks among the 3 leaders and the exhilaration of ultimate success. And then I watched closely, and the Carters started weeping, reliving that moment in history, perhaps, most assuredly thinking of the collision of hope versus experience in all the years since. There was another brief moment in September of 1993. By then, I was the chief White House correspondent for NBC. There was the handshake, a little forced, coaxed, between Arafat and Rabin on the South Lawn of the White House that day in September. Then the assassination of an Israeli leader who, at least at that time, he took risks for peace. And that relationship between Bill Clinton and Yitzhak Rabin was so paternal and so interesting. They really did have a bond, and that's why it all became possible. And then, of course, the Bill Clinton final marathon effort at Camp David to try to repeat Jimmy Carter's miracle in the waning days of his administration. I once asked him why he took that risk to devote so much time at Camp David. At the end there in 2000, when he was about to leave office, and when at the beginning of those negotiations, if my memory serves me correctly, the election was in the hands of the Supreme Court. And so we didn't know whether Clinton was going to be succeeded by Al Gore or George Bush, and we didn't know whether his policies were going to be continued. And I had traveled with Madeleine Albright to Pyongyang, the first trip of the Secretary of State to North Korea, and in October of 2000, and she came back with a commitment that there could be normalized relations and that this could be finalized by a presidential visit. And Clinton told me I had to weigh, do I go to North Korea or do I accept Arafat's promise that this time we're ready to make peace? And of course we know, for all sorts of reasons, it didn't happen. So he didn't go to North Korea, and that spring the policy was reversed by George Bush, and whether or not it would have happened anyway, but we can see the deteriorating relationship to this day in North Korea. But in any case, neither did we get Middle East peace. Now another president is about to embark on a diplomatic mission in Camp David tomorrow, unprecedented for this White House, although limited in scope, but facing new complexities emerging from the tectonic shifts in the Arab world in recent years. The Syrian civil war, to my mind, not addressed by American diplomacy in the last few years, the US overture to Iran, and the Arab and Israeli response. The Washington Post calls tomorrow Obama's Lonely Gulf Summit. What can or should the president do to try to reassure the Saudis, who lost confidence in this administration, frankly, when Mr. Obama declined to enforce his red line against Syria's President Assad? Absent a defense treaty, which is what the Saudis wanted, is it wise to offer more high-tech weaponry to a region already drowning in it? How do we interpret the actions of the new regime in Saudi Arabia, the first led by a branch of the royal family not directly descended from the kingdom's founding ruler? Will Yemen, as many are asking, be the kingdom's Vietnam? And this comes after one of the most fractious periods any of us can recall, at least going back to Reagan and Begin, a fractious period between the US leader and an Israeli prime minister, signified, of course, by the prime minister's speech to Congress and his being shunned by the White House. Now, having realized that they may have been too public in expressing their mutual dislike, the White House and perhaps Israel is also trying to smooth over the rupture of the past few months. We'll wait to see what happens after an Iran deal does or does not come together. Who were the audiences, though, for all of this drama and all of this conflict? The audiences are Salma and all of the other young people, the people in whom we invest all of the hopes of our generation, which frankly didn't get it right, hasn't, for the next generation to do a whole lot better. Young people all over the world must be watching this with dismay, if not with outright contempt or fear. How can we explain how this region has devolved since the so-called Arab Spring 4 years ago? Are today's Libya and Egypt what any of us had hoped for? Even as American policymakers continue to be haunted by the decisions that led the US into Iraq and the post-Saddam support for Nouri al-Maliki that arguably opened the door to ISIS. After a career covering these rare moments of hope in Camp David or Aqaba or elsewhere in the world, countered each time by diplomatic setbacks and often by violence and conflict, it strikes me that what we are lacking is leadership and vision on all sides. The very qualities that we are teaching and embracing in Seeds of Peace. It's so easy to accept the status quo. I remain an eternal optimist. Leslie Lewin shared with me what President Abbas said at the UN last fall when talking about seeds. President Abbas said, "Now I have told you about my world, the world of this old man, but you are young. In the language of youth, there is no such word as tired. In the vocabulary of youth, there is no such word as failure." That is a sentiment for all of us, even those of us who are old. Tonight, let's adopt the language of youth and say, there is no word as tired and no word as failure. Let these wonderful young people lead the way with, as Salma said, the power of empathy. Thank you.